Well, actually, Philadelphia set it up for me for what would later happen in my life. I played in the playgrounds of Philadelphia, most of it white at one time, but then it began to change with the coming of Wilt Chamberlain, Guy Rogers, Hal Lear, a friend that I became a lifelong friend with, George Raveling, and it began to change. And I remember going from playground to playground. Those days, you were a kid, you wanted to play with the best. These players knew the Philly game, pass and go, dribble, or the way they could shoot. They could dunk the basketball. None of we white guys could do that. But when the game was over, and I kind of felt sad about it at the time, even as a teenager, the African-American players would go their way and we'd go our way. The only meeting grounds of people that really got along was the basketball court. Early 60s, met a guy by the name of George Raveling, who ended up being one of the great rebounders in Villanova history, and also became their captain later on. I ended up going in 1960 to the Baltimore Colts. He ended up one more year, I think, at college, and then went and was the chief recruiter for Lefty Driesell, if you remember, the great coach at Maryland. And I started scouting, and he was scouting and trying to recruit for Maryland. And I'd see him all over the country at airports. I'd say, George, where the hell are you going today? He said, I got to go to this high school and recruit this guy. I said, well, I'm heading over to Mississippi. And we used to, have these wonderful conversations. As it turns out, one of the great turns in history is that Raveling, I think it was in his senior year, he and a friend of his decided to hitchhike from Philadelphia to Washington for the famous Martin Luther King I Have a Dream speech at the Lincoln Memorial. And there weren't, in those days, a lot of cops that were going to protect Martin Luther King. So they volunteered to stand behind Reverend Martin Luther King during his speech.
We will be able to speed up that day when all of God's children, black men and white men, Jews and Gentiles, Protestants and Catholics, will be able to join hands and sing in the words of the old Negro spiritual, free at last, thank God Almighty, we are free at last.
At the end of the speech, Raveling, who was standing, and you can see pictures of it today if we can find them, standing directly behind Martin Luther King, as kind of guarding him, looking around in case there were assassins. And he said to King, Dr. King, can I have that? It was King's famous speech. He said, yes. Raveling took it off the lectern. He has it today. It's worth millions. Nobody knows where he's going to put it, where he's leaving. George is my age now. And he's got it in the bank somewhere. Nobody knows. He's been offered millions for it. We shall overcome someday. When I started out the first time to scout, I started in 63, but 64 was my first experience into the cauldron that would be the next 8 or 9 years of America, which, by the way, we will never see again. I drove the whole country and saw all the different attitudes. I like the feeling of being with these great players. And again, they're mostly African American. I absolutely love that world. Grambling, Tennessee A&I, Alcorn A&M, Jackson State, Southern University, Fisk, Prairie View over in Texas. So I had planned to go to Memphis State. They had 4 or 5 different prospects, and I wanted to take 2 or 3 days there. And the assistant coaches, after my first day, I came back and I said to the coach, I want to stay another couple of days. There are 2 or 3 other players I want to see. And he said, it's never happened before in my life. And the coach said, I think you ought to go home. And I'm saying to myself, I must have done something wrong. You know, I either took too much time in the film room, or I was a pain in the neck. And I said, well, Coach, you know, I really want to stay for another day. He said, I think you ought to go home. He was very definitive. And I said, any reason why? And he said, well, Martin Luther King is coming in today, and he's going to lead a strike of the garbage workers on Friday. And he said, might not be safe around here. I never had anybody said that to me. So I went back to my room at the Holiday Inn, checked out, got a different flight, got on the plane, flew back to Baltimore, got off the plane. I got off the plane, looked up at the set.
This is a CBS News special report.
Good evening. Dr. Martin Luther King, the apostle of nonviolence in the civil rights movement, has been shot to death in Memphis, Tennessee.
Martin Luther King had been assassinated. I couldn't believe it. The whole world was on fire. Baltimore was on fire. Detroit, LA, I mean, it was surrealistic. Anybody today who thinks we're really in a tough time, everybody hates each other, the politics of America, they ain't seen nothing yet, as they say. This was America under siege.
And I've looked over and I've seen the promised land. I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we as a people will get to the promised land. So I'm happy tonight. I'm not worried about anything. I'm not fearing any man. Mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord.
One of the things that struck me, that still strikes me today, is the juxtaposition of all of the things that we see today and all of the things we've seen leading up to where we are in America. Is I juxtapose in my mind, what if I were African American and I was surrounded by an all-white world? How would I feel? That gave me the feeling as a white man that that's the way it must be for African Americans. And that's never left me. It's only reinforced me.
We've got some difficult days ahead, but it really doesn't matter with me now, because I've been to the mountaintop.